case you didn't get to meet me last time, my name's Sam Arnold. I'm from the Centre for Disability Studies. So before I hand over to Professor Patricia O'Brien to welcome you, some quick housekeeping. Toilets are over on your left if you sneak your way down the hall over there. There's 3 fire escapes, one over near the toilets, one near the lift, one over in this direction. If there is a fire, hopefully there won't be, but if there is, the lifts won't work. Please only keep 5 or 6 people in the lift. Apparently, just a week or so ago, they tried to pack 10 or more people in the lift, and the lift didn't work. So we'll hopefully not have that happen to us. Thank you everyone who visited the CDS forum since the first breakfast. I encourage you to visit the forum, post online, have a look at the photos. The video from Michael Goldsworthy is ready, but it isn't up there yet. Apologies, I'm still waiting on Michael just to have a chance to have a look at it and give his approval before we put it up there. Also, the Survey Monkey evaluation. Many thank you to those people who did fill in the Survey Monkey evaluation. We'll have the next Survey Monkey. I'll be emailing around to you tomorrow, most likely. We keep these Survey Monkey evaluations very short so that they won't take a lot of your time at all, only a few minutes, but they're going to be really helpful to us to put together this blueprint for change. So I really encourage you, please fill in that Survey Monkey that we email around. And responding to some of the feedback that you've given us already, just wanted to let you know, as much as possible, we have organised each of our Catalyst speakers where it's been possible that they'll also do a public workshop, and you should be receiving sort of an email telling you about that workshop if you want to send some other people along to that. So I've been reflecting on Michael Goldsworthy's presentation at the last breakfast. Perhaps you have all been as well. So reflecting on Michael Goldsworthy's presentation, I realised that I forgot to tell you about our wonderful centre, the Centre for Disability Studies. Our centre focuses on research, education, clinical practice, and we would be available to consult with you on evaluating any innovation in service delivery you may be trialling. We would be interested in partnering in research with you, or perhaps provide you with best practice education to your support staff, or perhaps clinical support or supervision. So there you go, changes since Michael Goldsworthy's presentation. And on another note, CDS will be hosting this year a direct support professional conference in late July. Call for abstracts now open, and I'll be telling you more about that, I'm sure, over the coming weeks. And we're also looking for people who may be interested in sponsoring the conference. But that's enough from me. I would like to now hand you to Professor Patricia O'Brien. Now, last breakfast I told you a little about Tricia's groundbreaking work around inclusive research and education, so I thought I might tell you at this breakfast that Tricia was the lead author of the book Human Services Towards Partnership and Support. I give you Professor Patricia O'Brien.
Well, thanks very much, Sam, and couldn't think of a nicer way to be introduced and acknowledge the work that Sam has done in between the last breakfast and now, and also you will remember Claire from the last breakfast. So thank you to Claire and Sam for working as part of the team in preparing today's presentations. Presently I'll introduce you to Michael Kendrick, but in the meantime I'd just like to say that this conversation today is about possibilities, and if you open your book you will see, if you go to the second page, there's a little bit there about what Block wishes to share with us about the possibility conversation. As you know, each of these conversations, the topics are following the model that Peter Block puts out, and Peter Block believes that if we're going to bring about change, it does come through conversation. And so the last conversation was really an invitation, through Michael Goldsworthy acting as a catalyst, to consider all the issues associated with the introduction of the change that will come about through the NDIS. Now, today's conversation is about possibilities, and Michael isn't just the right person to raise possibilities with us, but just let's have a look at what Block is saying about possibilities. It's under the heading Possibility Conversation. He sees that this conversation supports us to see a new future, in a unique way. And it's really not an aim and an objective, a possibility conversation, but rather it just gives us a venue in which we can make a statement about a future that we see that is beyond our reach at present. he believes it does come from consideration of what we looked at last time, which was the crossroads that your organisations are at. But I think the 3 bullet points are important, that possibilities come from imagination, they need to be created together. As a result, we're having the breakfast series where we can mix and mingle with people from other organisations. Our ideas can be created together and they can then be transferred back into our organisation. But also a possibility conversation enables you to make a declaration. Even if you don't make it publicly while you're here, it might be a declaration that you make to yourself of something new that you're going to start the journey on, and it's a declaration of a future to come. And if we make that declaration, then that's something for us to try and aspire to and to live up to. So in opening up the possibility conversation, I just want to have a round of reflections on anything that's come to mind associated with the first breakfast. So from the last breakfast, what information would you suggest as a priority to go into the Blueprint for Change, which is the document that we as an organising team, supported by our steering group, which is inclusive of both Ben and Shirley and David, who is yet to arrive, and you have to Adele and Trish from Foresight. So as a group, we will be developing something that comes out of this series, and we're very keen to gain your support on this. So as we go around the table, I thought maybe we would just start, not necessarily answering that question, but just a reflection on something that you either took away from the last workshop or you've been thinking about. And then we will then go back around the tables just for 2 or 3 suggestions on what you would give priority to from Michael Goldsworthy's presentation that should influence our blueprint. Excuse me. So, if you could introduce yourself by name, and Claire will graph up our names again, and just a comment on something that you've been reflecting on since the last breakfast. So could I have somebody to start? Okay, oh thanks, Chris, from the last breakfast, great.
Well, it's very easy because I wasn't here for the last breakfast, so I've got nothing to reflect on. My name's Chris Campbell, I'm the CEO of the Junction Works. Apologies for not making it, I didn't intend to, but there's other circumstances and other places I need to be. But so unfortunately, nothing to add.
That's great, and you're really welcome, Chris, thanks. Could you pass it on to which side are you?
Hi, I'm Maria from Woodville Community Services. What's been making me reflect since the last conversation is the fact that we need to partner up, or just thinking of thinking outside just of our organization, and just the possibility that if we want to survive, we have to partner up and just look at different ways.
Okay, great. Thanks, Maria. That's great. Adele.
Hi, I'm Adele from the One Gap Foundation. I think from the last conversation, the main thing that I took away from it was that real need to look outside of our sector for strategies for change, which I found really interesting, because I think that for the most part we've really been looking inside the sector and how it's been affecting the sector and what's been happening overseas in different countries and how it's affecting the sector, but actually looking into the commercial sector for change.
Good. Sir, would you like to introduce yourself to people?
Sure. I'm Sir Hadovas. I'm the CEO of Wingap. I wasn't here last series, so apologies, but I can't add anything.
That's okay. Great. Pauline.
Hi, I'm Pauline Stanley. I work in National Disability Services, and my reflections, I suppose, since the last conversation have been mainly about the role that I do is change management and working with organisations. And certainly in the last 14 months, I've been trying to talk to people and try and turn the heat up where we felt perhaps it wasn't, in terms of people looking at what they needed to do, in terms of getting their business ready. My role is to work with organisations and CEOs about their business and the leadership role. And I've probably spent a lot of time with the reflections on thinking about what will it take for leaders to relinquish their traditional authority in organisations to begin to work more dynamically in partnerships with people. So that's what I've been spending most
Thanks,
of my
Paula.
thinking.
That was good. Shall we come over here, Michael?
Michael Austin, Catholic Care Sydney. Look, a number of things, but I think two. I've mentioned I think getting the conversations happening in the workplace across. We're quite a diverse organisation, so I think across the whole, and coordinating the parts. So I think a big take home for me was the whole of organisation change involvement. So it's very important to have all the coordinated parts moving in the one direction.
So, whole organisational reform. Thank you. Julie.
I'm Julie McCready and I work for Uniting Care Disability. For me, I guess the reflection that I've had over the last 10 days, fortnight, has been around the fact that as an organisation where I felt that we were kind of not doing as much as I thought. The more I thought about it, the more I realised actually we are. It just didn't feel like it was that. So his talk last time kind of brought it all together, made it pull it together for me, and that made sense about what we're doing and where we're going.
Okay, so it made it more cohesive for you.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much. Catherine.
I'm Cathy Watts from Integrated Living. The things that stood out for me and what have been in my mind, the changing community services as a whole. We have worked with Michael for some time, but again it's sort of showed the importance of that. And you know, in a few years' time we're going to look back and see how different it is. But also, you know, while we're so busy working on our processes and systems, trying to get ready for it, what stuck in my mind was when I was working in one of the groups with Ben, we have to remember to deliver quality service.
Right. Okay then. Great. Thanks very much. So, emphasis on quality. Thanks, Peter.
Peter Knight from Wesley Mission. And there were lots of things. One thing that really struck me from the seminar was when he was looking at the transition from different other areas of care, in particular disability employment services, because it had only been a week or two before that our Wesley Mission had lost all of its disability employment services, and they were within our area as well. And yet in each of those areas we were actually the best provider, you know, but it didn't matter about that, the way that they did all the assessment. You had to be not just the best provider in an area, but the best provider of all sorts of other areas as well that were geographically separate. And so the whole thought about joining with other organisations and what that means to do that, and just the way he presented that was very powerful. And perhaps one comment that he said that has gone through my mind a little bit is that disabilities are notorious for over-servicing and cross-subsidisation.
Okay.
And he talked about cross-subsidisation, and it's just the way that actually it's unhealthy to think in that way. Each area does need to be sort of managed within its own thing, and Wesley Mission once again is just notorious for cross-subsidisation. Whatever we make from one program just gets tipped into the other loss-making program, and it all ends up being Wesley Mission. But
right. So over-servicing and
cross-subsidisation.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Thanks.
Paula Marr from Wesley Mission. I wasn't here last conversation. However, my reflections to date really have been around organisational change and how do we achieve that in such a, we too as quite a diverse organisation, and how we build momentum to fuel the change, and how do we generate that leadership and visioning for the organisation to ensure that we are ready.
Great, thanks Paula. So momentum for change. Linda.
I'm Linda Ward from Sunshine, and I wasn't here last week.
Oh right, okay.
Session.
Because I saw you just recently at Michael's workshop. It seems as though you were here. Yeah. Okay, great. Is anybody else coming from Sunshine? Or you?
Gail.
Gail. Oh, great. Okay. We go to the back table.
Carly Golden from Catholic Care. strongly was again the over-servicing and cross-subsidisation, and also the impact in which disabilities will have, especially within our organisation, because we're really diverse. So it is an actual whole organisational reform, like not dissimilar to Michael's, as we do such a wide variety, and to get both person-centred through, but also to get the way in which funding is going to be changing, and people actually will be purchasing a wide range of quality services is something that we do well, but we need to look strongly at the way in which it's structured.
Okay, great. So thanks very much.
Hi, Ben from Northcott. I guess the thing I've been reflecting on is just all the challenges that the sector has to face in the future, and just how similar those challenges are across the whole board of disability industry.
Great, good. Thanks. The challenges.
Sarah, I'm here in the capacity of supporting and overdoing, but I was there last time, and I think just the thing that I took away was organisations will have to respond to change, or else they won't survive.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Shirley.
My name is Shirley. The last convention was many questions, unknown, and changing organization.
Great. Thanks, Shirley. Picking up the theme of change as well. Sue, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Sue from Northcott as well, and this will be my first time at this conversation. And I'm standing in for Liz, but sort of quite disappointed that I wasn't permanently standing in for Liz.
Yeah.
But just very, very excited and very interested to hear what we're going to hear today.
Great, good. Okay, my own reflection on last time was that there was a sense of cultural change that was starting to occur within organisations, and there was also a sense in which we were prepared to reach out to one another as well. I don't know, Sam, if you had a reflection from last time that you'd like to make?
I guess also from the other times where we've had the pleasure of Michael Goldsworthy, I think really moving away from that historical charity sort of approach to a more business approach, and saw me trying to plug the CDS could do for you just this morning. Maybe I need to work on those marketing skills to really move into this new world.
Yeah, he's certainly a good marketer. Any reflections from yourself from last time?
I really just enjoyed the opportunity to come last time, seeing I missed it last year.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. But what I'd like you to do now is just to have a quick buzz talk around the table. If you were to give us any feedback from Michael Goldsworthy's presentation on something that should be carried into this booklet that we're going to develop, or these set of videos we're going to develop, or this package, we're still, as I said, trying to work out what it will look like. What would be some ideas that you would like to leave us with? You might have one major idea from the table, or two or three. So if you could just chat like that for about 5 minutes, and then we'll take those down, and then I'll introduce you to Michael. So you just need somebody to facilitate that discussion on the table, and then we'll come around and pick up your ideas. Okay, can we bring it to a close there now? Thanks. We'll just move around the tables, and Claire will just graph up any of the ideas that you have. So can we start with the back table? Carly, who on your table might like to make a suggestion? Sue, yeah. Okay. Can people hear one another? Okay, great. Go ahead.
The three things we spoke about was the need to be proactive, for organisations to be proactive.
Great.
And then we had quite a long discussion on what proactive actually looked like.
Good.
And working collaboratively with community and other services around. And linked to that, making use of business or other organisations for input and their insights.
Okay, great. So proactivity, collaboration, and maybe partnership with other organisations came out of his presentation. So thank you for that. Can we come to this table? Who might report back to this table?
Well, actually, we came up with very similar headings, I suppose. We talked about having more the need to work outside our organisations and work more around alliances and partnerships to create opportunities for people. We spoke a little bit about the roles of governance and the responsibility of governors joining or not joining our boards, and how the movement towards a more risk sort of business is having an impact in that whole conversation too. And we talked about taking more affirmative action in terms of inclusiveness.
So something additional that you picked up was the issues around governance and risk assessment, or versus risk assessment.
Well, how that's impacting on perhaps people not being as open to joining not-for-profit board because of that new risk dynamic that's coming in. So, you know, people often join because there was a willingness around the mission, and now people are, this is very risky business now because of lots of the, what I call the business end, the lack of financial sustainability, all those things that are putting people off.
Sure. Yeah. Good point. Okay. The back table? Who's going to report back?
Much of what we said. The zone of mutual benefit was one thing we chatted about, and just perhaps tie some of those other things together up there, that rather than reinvent the wheel, that if you have organisations that overlap in some way, that you can identify that zone and work together closely in it. And it may be all the extent of a merger, that's a full zone of mutual benefit, but it might be just at other levels as well. But,
that's a good point. So mutual benefit coming from all partnering rather than reinventing the wheel. Okay, so small group here. Michael, have you got any comments?
Group two. We spoke about the big picture context in terms of, I guess, situating the disability part of a much broader human services director and all the different reports you spoke about. So I think for diverse organisations, that's a good message around. It's not solely disability areas, it's the human services generally. That move to the free market, I think some pretty clear messages for us there around basically if you don't adapt, you're not going to survive. I think was so. I think setting up your changes, it's all different things we've talked about. The importance of understanding that new operating environment, but also learning from other sectors where that's already been in place. There's a mention of employment, and there's lessons to be learned from. There's been an outcomes-based funding in some of those areas, Job Services Australia, so there can be learnings from other areas.
That was great. So you particularly picked up on the way he started and sort of gave us information about that it's just not the disability sector that's undergoing reform, and the comments about the free market. So thank you. So Claire, are you in a position to just feed back any of that?
Yes, sure.
Great, thank you.
So the question we're looking at is what's really a priority for this blueprint for change, and what have you got out of the workshop a couple of weeks ago with Michael Goldsworthy? So a few of the things that have come up are that really, as an organisation, we need to be proactive and collaborate and look at co-productivity, also with working outside the organisation. So not just looking internally, but how can we build partnerships and maybe even some mergers, looking at the zone of mutual benefit. And it's not just about disability, it's a whole organisation. It's organisation-wide, not just the disability sector. I know many of your organisations are made of lots of different areas, so it's not just disability focused. We're looking to move the whole organisation forward. It's about governance. We're moving into some risky business, and maybe people are not as open to join. And
Great. Well done, Claire. Thank you. Thanks for that. That's really helpful. That helps focus us as a group going forward in terms of developing the blueprint. So I think now, Michael, it's my pleasure to introduce you. Many of you will know of Michael, but Michael is a consultant to disability organisations across the world, really. You've been doing a lot of work out here now for many years. You've made hundreds of trips to Australia, England, Scotland, Ireland in particular, and continuing to come back to this part of the world. So Michael written many articles, and you'll see some of his publications in the booklet that has been developed for today. Also in the publication you will see a photograph of a recent edition of his papers that have been put out by the Community Resource Unit in Queensland. But I think I'd also like to introduce Michael as a friend. We've worked together now over many years. We've seen change, and there's no better person than Michael to be a catalyst for change. So Michael, I'll ask my colleagues here to join with me in welcoming you. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. How's everybody? Good. Well, the questions that come to my mind are a little less organizational than they are in terms of leadership and innovation when it comes to change. Because, of course, you can have change that takes you backwards, and not all change brings you forward. And not all changes are unilaterally forward or backward. You get mixed elements of change, and we've always had that. And so in this sense, organizational change may be overrated as a driver of reality. That what we've really enjoyed, if you look in the disability sector, has been really at least 2 generations of forward progress in the lives of people with disabilities. And all of the toing and froing of organizations really is secondary to the fact that we've been able to actually push the horizon outward and forward such that people with disabilities really have a very realistic chance for looking forward to a much better life than would have been the case a couple of generations ago. In fact, we can't find in human history any other period where we've made so much progress. So in that sense, we're inheriting a kind of legacy of 2 generations of change, and in this case, not trivial change, but quite dramatic changes. And the question that will arise, even though we probably won't get to it today, will be, can we sustain that change into the future, or will it at some point simply just implode into some kind of collapse of progress? Nobody wants that to happen, but of course these things do happen. The clock just doesn't go forward, sometimes it goes backwards. So that's a separate kind of question, though. The question this morning really is, can we feed the change that has been already started in terms of the broader view of what's possible in people's life? And that is, to me, the decisive question, because even if we change our organizations but do nothing with the vision, then we will have lost the point, really. We want to improve our organizations to do something. And what is the something we want them to do is the kind of central question. And if one doesn't really have an answer to the question of how does one make people's lives better, then whatever you're doing organizationally will lack substance, because you have to engage the kind of the key issue, which is how do we push the horizon in terms of what's possible for people. And of course, the best way to think about that is to look at what we've already done and simply to sustain that if we can, but also, of course, to continue to evolve it. And this is an ongoing kind of revolutionary process that we're involved in, because we want a revolution. We don't want people with disabilities to have second-class, third-class lives. We want people with disabilities to have a good shot at as good a life as anybody else. That should be really the standard. That's what got us to where we are today, is the willingness to see people with disabilities as being as valuable and as important human beings as any other group in society, and to have the opportunity to look forward to some kind of a life that is equitable and satisfying for them. And that is a revolutionary activity, because we had to turn things over in many, many parts of our lives to make it possible for people with disabilities to get a good life. It wasn't automatically going to be provided. It was a very protracted struggle over these last 2 generations to really challenge almost everything about the way we live, so that people can get a life. And that's a very interesting kind of struggle, because the nice thing about it is we've actually succeeded in that struggle, and that's of course very hopeful. There's a quote from Helen Keller, of course, who was both blind and deaf. She says, "It's a terrible thing to see and to have no vision." And so the question isn't really, can you see, but what do you see with your mind's eye? If we have nothing in our mind's eye that leads us forward, then we won't see a way forward. It begins in the mind, and not just in individual minds, but in the collective mind of all of us, that we form a vision of what might be realistic, might be possible. And whether that's in work or in social life or in relationships or in home life, these questions are very important. If we don't see a way forward, we can't build it. We can't create it, we can't negotiate it, we can't pay for it, because it all comes down to, do we have a way forward, and can we kind of picture what the good life would look like? There's a quote from Pema Chodron, when you don't choose the same old way, the same old stale storyline, then there's the opportunity for something new and fresh to present itself to you. The world can open up in an unprecedented way. And of course, what the challenge is here is, are we even open-minded? We all, of course, like to think we're open-minded, but we're only open-minded to ideas we already agree with in many cases. To be genuinely open-minded, we often have to be disturbingly challenging to ourselves, to, in a sense, break out of our patterns of thinking, our ways of thinking. And of course, when we can do that, then there's always the hope of a kind of moving forward, because then we aren't trapped. And of course, what freezes us in place is the inability to look beyond what we're familiar with, what we're comfortable with, and so on. I'm quite reminded of the quote, you know, we must comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. When we are too comfortable, then we're not doing our best thinking. We must be disturbed about something sometimes to do our best thinking. And there's nothing worse than the complacent when it comes to making change. Complacent people are much, much too comfortable. But disturbed people, in this sense, concerned people, find that they do eventually find a new way forward. Again, to quote Helen Keller, while they were saying among themselves, "It cannot be done, it was done." It's one of my favorite quotes, actually, because it's sort of reminiscent of my own life. I can't recall the number of times I've been told, "Oh, it can't be done," only to have to tell people, well, it's been done, and it's been done for 2 decades here, 3 decades there, and so on. But I'm always struck by how authoritative people sound when they say it can't be done. It's quite a striking source of authority for people that don't know what they're talking about. And interestingly enough, even the changes proposed in the NDIS are old changes. The self-direction individual funding's been around for 3 decades in many jurisdictions, so it's not very mysterious, even if you're not familiar with it. There's a track record, even in Australia, of, in some cases, over a decade of experience with it. So even though it's presented as kind of new and different and whatnot, it's actually a quite well-studied phenomenon, not just in this sector, but in many sectors. It's been around for quite some time. This is a quote from Mark Twain. There are those who would misteach us that to stick in a rut is consistency and a virtue, and that to climb out of the rut is inconsistency and a vice. And of course, this is the case for the status quo. That how dare you not do the status quo? But if we stay with the status quo, we stay put. There's an absolute necessity not to stay with the status quo when it comes to improving people's lives. Otherwise, we're sentencing people to the level of progress we got to today. And if you think today is as good as it gets, that might be selling us short in terms of what might still be ahead of us. So this is the danger of status quo thinking, that we would freeze things in today's sort of level. And if you think in terms of other movements, where I grew up, I was originally Canadian. In Canada, in the 70s, women couldn't get a bank loan without their husband's permission. Now imagine if we had frozen things at the 1970s in terms of women, we'd never know what 2011 would look like, would we? We'd still be back at that kind of paternalistic, women as children, men as adults, kind of world. So I'm grateful we didn't fast freeze it in the late 70s, because we've had all this progress since. And so I think this is what Mark Twain is kind of cautioning us about, that we've simply got to move past where we are today. And that's not simply for change's sake itself, but change that benefits people, and defining what that change might look like. That's our challenge. This is a very famous writer. If my mind can conceive it and my heart can believe it, I know I can achieve it. And here the question isn't really, is there a vision, but do we believe it? Do we have any conviction about a vision? Because with a vision without conviction leaves people with no resolve to do anything. And visionary people who don't want to do anything are kind of useless, because what do they achieve? They achieve very visionary thinking that they do nothing with. And in this sense, the application of vision to practical problems is, of course, the means in coming to decision to persevere with a particular vision. So that decisiveness in leaders and others is quite significant. No decisiveness, no progress. This is a quote from Goethe: if you treat an individual as he is, he will stay as he is. But if you treat him as if he were what he ought to be and could be, he will become what he ought to be and could be. And of course, in disability, this is the key thing, that people tend to under-expect from people with disabilities rather than lift the bar in terms of expectations. And people with disabilities have essentially exceeded all expectations going back decade after decade after decade. People today with disabilities are living lives that were inconceivable at the time when they began many of these kind of pioneering changes. So the question of, are we prepared to see greater potential in the lives of people with disabilities is, of course, the crux of the matter. If we are, then potentially we will exceed it in terms of what people are able to accomplish with their lives. And we still live in a world where we see people with disabilities and tone down our expectations rather than be willing to kind of raise them. But wherever we do raise them, we now have amazing things that are accomplished. For instance, there are parts of the world today where 60 to 70% of people with disabilities are working at regular jobs in the community. And I can remember other jurisdictions where it would have been 10, 15%. So you don't get from 15% to 65% by being kind of wimpy on the vision front. You get there because you hold out the hope that all kinds of people that are currently unemployed could one day be working, and eventually you do get there, a couple of percent per year possibly, but nonetheless you ramp up those kind of realities. So vision in this case is a picture of what is perceived at a moment in time as being possible in life, Vision can change almost in an instant if one encounters realities that really make one think or to reconsider some of our assumptions. Assumptions are, of course, the nature of them are that we take them to be true. But what we've taken to be true may simply not be true. When I think of the number of people I've been told, oh, they could never live on their own, who are today living on their own, I remember those assumptions. And of course, I work with people sometimes that are considered the absolute most difficult people to serve in the service system. And that's mostly managers, really, because the clients are a piece of cake by comparison. The reality is that these assumptions about particular groups may not actually be very real. When I think of the number of people that are doing just fine today that used to be considered the worst of the worst, I have to, I have to go back to that again and again, because I'm grateful somebody challenged some of these assumptions about people. Oh, they'll never be able to do this, they'll never be able to do that, and they're doing so well today. I'm grateful that somebody challenged them. But vision is formed in one's mind, and competent managers without vision get nothing done that's going to be visionary. They'll get things done that may be good management, but good management combined with vision produces a different kind of outcome. Good management with vision brings social progress. So you've got to decide whether the emphasis should be on simply good management or good management linked to a kind of progressive vision. And that's a very different kind of management challenge, because you can manage in the status quo, but I thought our sector was about change, I thought it was about progress, I thought it was about liberation of people, achieving potentials that haven't been achieved. And if that's the vision we have for our sector, then we need managers that are visionary. Because you can't manage, well, you could manage without vision, but you'd be simply maintaining. To be visionary, you have to take up the substantive challenge of how do people get a good life. And once we're into that challenge, of course, then all the talent of managers, workers, advocates, families then can be mobilized. But we do need the vision for that to happen. And we can continue to evolve the vision. We don't have to think that the 2011 is the kind of, or 2013 is the kind of end point of human history. There's more yet beyond us, but we have to kind of dare to kind of look beyond where we've got to today. So the vision can evolve, and thankfully it does evolve, because we should question our earlier vision. I remember when we first got people out of institutions, it seemed so much better than the institution. Until, of course, you see that the ideas of the 1970s look a little dated today, sort of a group home in every pot, and yet we're still building group homes in 2013 when we can offer people all kinds of other alternatives. So, in a sense, for some people at least, the vision is still back in the 1970s and 80s. People have not moved past that. And so vision can be shaped to expand or limit life's actual practical possibilities. And because of that, we have hope then of getting past the things that limit us today. Without vision, I don't know how we would do that. We have to see a way past what has blocked us up to this point. And imagining better is the key way that this happens. That when we can imagine better, we are asking ourselves, what does it look like when it's better? And that's a very practical question, believe it or not, because if you can picture it, someday you'll build it, so to speak. But you have to be able to see it to go then find the means to create it. And that starts in the imagination. I was thinking, of Mr. Steve Jobs, and all the nice devices Mr. Jobs brought us, but every one of those devices, somebody had to imagine what it was long before they could build, the iPhone 5, and I suppose I'll live someday to see the iPhone 45, or whatever. But all of these things started as a kind of unreal reality that then became real. And so we benefit today from all these toys. I'm not sure we're all that better off with all the toys, but certainly they have a kind of marvelousness to them, I think. But they began in our imagination, and then people tested the imagination. Could we build it? Could we create it? Can we solve the technology problem? Can we solve the marketing problem? Can we find the suppliers? And all the questions that are practical. But it begins with the view. We want to build something we've never built before, create something that wasn't there before. And we don't know what that looks like typically. We start with very rough ideas. And when it comes to people's lives, it starts with their unhappiness. When you ask what's better, you have to pay attention to what people are unhappy about in their life. When they're bored most of the time, when they have no friends, and that's an unhappiness. When they're deprived of achievements, when people don't respect their voice, when their rights are violated. All these sources of unhappiness can be countered with imaginative responses that compensate for the things that make people unhappy. But if we're not prepared to look at the shortcomings of our services, of our society, of people's lives, then we won't engage the underlying unhappiness with the question of what would be better. Now, you don't want to go around getting yourself all depressed by paying attention to unhappiness 1, unhappiness 2, and so on. That's not my point. But why not solve the unhappiness? Why not resolve the unhappiness? Why not find a way forward so that that unhappiness is something we put in the past, something that is behind us? And that question, which is an imaginative question, it's not simply a technical question, is of course anchoring our progress in the existential realities of people's lives in 2013. In other words, if this was the starting point today, where is it that people are unhappy, and what might we do about that that would have some chance of possibly succeeding? Now, people call this process dreaming, and when I first heard the term, I thought, oh, it's too fuzzy a term, I don't like it, and so on. Because I thought it didn't sound tough-minded enough to me. But as I kind of got used to the term, I began to realize that we have actually a long history of social science and psychology and so on that does link the process of unconscious and conscious problem solving to social progress. In essence, many of the things that have led us ahead have begun as a dream. Again, I'm thinking Martin Luther King's very famous speech on the Washington Mall. I have a dream. I have black children and white children living together and so on. Do you remember that speech? Kind of one of the great speeches. But that dream didn't have any reality to it until the dream was kind of articulated and named. And it went on to have some very practical effects. But remember, it had no immediate kind of practicality at that point. It was simply a dream, but a dream now that is lived in very important ways because he dared to have it and name it. And of course, it wasn't just King that had that dream. He was speaking, I think, for all of us, that he was seeing a world that did not yet exist, but in time would. And of course it has. We even have in some countries multiracial presidents, to everybody's surprise. And in that particular country, we may soon have a woman president and a blonde as well. If Hillary Clinton gets elected, God forbid, where will it end? But the reality is of course, that if we do change, it's because the dream preceded the practicality. The dream, if you like, invited the practicality into existence. But you have to have the dream first. This is a quote from Heraclitus. Even a soul submerged in sleep is hard at work and helps make something of the world. And this, of course, was written over 2,000 years ago. And it's probably still true, you know. God knows what the Romans could have known, but they obviously must have known something. He's reminding us that that when we sleep, we're still at work. And from those struggles at sleep, we eventually turned it into practical solutions. This is a quote I always like. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. So in this sense, to listen to the deeper longings in ourselves and others, to listen to the intuitive mind is something that we need to take more seriously, because from that will come the sources of new visions and new practicalities. Though he really needs some help with that hair, don't you think? Just like who does his hair?
It's not a servant.
Hmm?
It's not a servant to anything.
Yeah, that's true. His hair has a mind of its own. That's a good point. So dreams do not usually emerge as final versions. They're very often rough versions. I'm sure the original version of the iPad had nothing to do with the iPad that we know today, but something like an iPad was envisioned, because of course up to that point we'd had laptops. And to not have a laptop, to have a tablet, now seems quite normative, but to imagine a tablet before people had tablets, I think was pretty courageous kind of imagining. So paying attention to the thing that's a hint of where we might go is the beginning of finding that thing. But it begins as a hint, not as a clear-cut, oh, this is an iPad. It's the idea, well, maybe we can just leave laptops behind. Maybe laptops are so yesterday. And be willing to kind of step out of laptop status quo and move to something else, you know. Now, it isn't that all dreams need to come true to be useful. You can have dreams that you're just quite content to have, but some dreams may be ones that you want to pursue, and pursue quite vigorously. How many of you daydream but don't do much with your daydreams? You daren't say too much at this point, I think, but otherwise you get into the content. But the reality is that dreams don't always have to be acted on. They're not important enough. But if they were important enough, we would need then to kind of embrace them and do something with them. And this is more likely to be true when people's unexplored potentials are substantial. And this is what we found in disability, is that we've completely underestimated people with disabilities and their capacities to enjoy life. Because people tend to think, oh, people with disabilities have to create every element of life for themselves, and if they can't, then we stop thinking about it. But the reality is that we can partner with people with disabilities to get a good life, and what people with disabilities can't do will get done some other way. So in this sense, thinking about people's sort of limitations is not really going to kind of open up many vistas, because we're trapped with that thought rather than the thought of what can people enjoy in life. And once you go down that road, then you find that people can enjoy all kinds of things that they have limitations in creating. And of course that's true for all of us. So the real question is, are we prepared to explore that potential? Because that potential will lead us somewhere, because that potential is present. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had 2 generations of progress. We've been able to work with that potential and find that actually it bears fruit. This is a quote from Dennis Waitley: "A dream is your creative vision for your life in the future. You must break out of your current comfort zone and become comfortable with the unfamiliar and the unknown." And I think that challenge to us is to disturb ourselves. That when we're too comfortable, we're not likely to do very much. But when we are uncomfortable, we're much more likely to do some of our best thinking. And most people don't like to get up in the morning and say, God, I need to be uncomfortable today. It's just not in our nature to do that. but it is in our discomfort with many things that we have the seeds of original thinking and so on. This is a quote from Tolstoy. Free thinkers are those who are willing to use their minds without prejudice and without fearing to understand things that clash with their customs, privileges, or beliefs. This state of mind is not common, but it is essential for right thinking. Where it is absent, discussion is apt to become worse than useless. So again, it's a different way of putting it, but he's saying if we are bound by custom, privileges, and belief, we are imprisoning ourselves. When we can see past them, we give ourselves freedom to go where we've never gone before, a bit like a kind of Star Trek challenge. And in fact, we find ourselves actually going there. But again, as I said earlier, you have to make decisions to go there. You have to resolve to do that. And in many cases, you're not sure where you're going. You're simply out on an exploration, really. And nobody can tell you at the beginning of an exploration how it's going to turn out, whether it'll be fruitful or not. It's a bit like a kind of pilgrimage. You really have to undertake the pilgrimage with the hope that you will find something, a kind of search for things, not knowing what the answer is. Now, people can survive such explorations, but we can't survive if we need the answer before we start. Because sometimes the answer is waiting, but we don't know what it is, and it may surprise us. The answer may be quite different from what we were thinking. Now, as we work with a vision, the vision teaches us that it wasn't a good enough vision. That as we actualize and problem solve around vision, we find it creates a circular feedback loop to our vision, that we have to adjust our vision because some of our original assumptions or thinking needs to be updated and rethought a little bit. But again, if we're not willing to let our vision crash and burn a bit and then go back to the drawing board, we have to do it right the first time. It's almost like the beta version's the final version. But in reality, we have 50 beta versions before we get something that actually works. I'm reminded of the people that learned to fly airplanes, design and fly airplanes. If you ask them, what do you do for a living? They'd say, well, we crash airplanes. Because that's what they did mostly. They'd get up in the air for 4 or 5 seconds, crash, go back, spend a month getting the aircraft rebuilt, try it again, crash again. And somehow in all that, eventually we were able to fly. But the beginning years were not pretty. It was dangerous, it was unsatisfactory, it was a fool's errand. And you could just imagine people watching these airplanes crash all the time saying, oh, these people must be absolutely impractical, they'll never, people will never fly, and so on. But of course, that's the testing of the vision to get it to the stage of practicality. And of course, today it's very practical. And remember, this is a good example actually of many of the things that we envision as practical today actually had been envisioned hundreds of years ago, centuries ago. For instance, the Romans had and the Greeks had working ideas of submarines. They even did experiments with submarines. Jules Verne, when he wrote about submarines and so many thousand leagues under the sea, came up with a version with Captain Nemo of a submarine that wasn't too far off from what submarines look like today. So the vision was there, and the practicalities had been attempted. In fact, we had working submarines even a couple of 100 years ago. Again, if you go back to Star Trek, the famous scene in Star Trek where they say, "Beam me up, Scotty." It's my favorite, actually. I'm still hoping for that. Sure beats jet lag. But the thing that they flipped out to call the Starship Enterprise, remember? Does that sort of look like a flip phone to you? It was. It's essentially was the precursor of the modern cell phone, And it's a mobile communication device. Right now that's real, the mobile communication device. What's not real is the little thing, where it goes like this and then you go back up to the spaceship. But how many of you think that the thing that does all this and takes you up might someday be real? I'm not going to say it can't be real. I don't know how the hell to do it. I hope you go first. Let me know how it goes. Call me on your flip phone when you get there. And if it's okay, maybe some of the rest of us will join you. But somebody will have to go first. So practical challenges are good for our vision, and we will face them, and they will often be quite discouraging. This is what experimenters and innovators find. But on the other side of it, they do solve problems once we learn from each difficulty and eventually overcome them. It's very interesting with the 787 Dreamliner. They're having a little bit of problem with the lithium ion batteries, but who would have thought they could build a totally new airplane anyways? So a few problems with them may not be fatal ultimately, and one would have expected that kind of a problem actually. It's part and parcel of trying to get a new aircraft out there. So we do need to be constructive about the challenge of struggle of implementing our vision. And when you think of people with disabilities, just think about where people are today. You don't have to kind of get ready for this. You can start imagining better just with life as it is for people today. Don't worry about people's disability. Knowing that people can't do something is kind of irrelevant, because everybody in this room can't do something. So if we stop living because we can't do something, or we don't have a particular skill or something, it's kind of a waste of time. It's a kind of given that most of us can't do something. So what can we do? Well, we focus on what people can do, what they can enjoy, what their real capacities are, and their underdeveloped potentials, and then see what we can do with those. And we can explore this question one person at a time. If we think of the NDIS, I guess that's so not the phrase anymore, but whatever that thing is, the great opportunity in it may be that we can explore one person at a time. And imagine if we add vision to the challenge of one person at a time. If you're going to create solutions that are one person at a time, and you have vision, then we can have thousands of breakthroughs one person at a time. That's the great potential benefit of being able to concentrate just on one person and see what that person could do with their life. And so you want to pay attention to what the person is like. You can build right from the person, who they are, what they aren't, for that matter, and what they enjoy in life, what they might be open to trying. And in that process, we may see a great unfoldment of all that potential that we know is there. But you don't really do this by asking people what they want, because sometimes people can answer that question, but a lot of times people will just shrug, because even people themselves don't know what they want always, but they definitely would like something. So having your annual bureaucratic moment with them each year, where you discuss with them the life they're not going to get, won't do the trick. You really have to do something a little bit more prolonged and stay with people through many conversations, because those conversations eventually will bear fruit. But it won't be in some kind of formal, person-centered planning exercise alone. And it may be a shocker to some of you, but whole civilizations have come and gone without person-centered plans. So we don't want to put our money just on that horse. You can have a good life without a person-centered plan. But you want to avoid premature realism, and that is where we don't think about things unless you can do it Monday. Oh, we can't think about that because we can't do it Monday. Well, a lot of good things in life you can't do Monday. You got to wait till you get all the things in place to do it. For instance, how many of you think it's kind of nice to be in love? Anybody like that? A lot of people like being in love. Well, you can't do love Monday. You can't go to Love R Us and say, I'd like your Monday special. How many of you, though, would hold out and long to be in love and be considered a realist? Well, you are a realist. How many of you ended up finding somebody that can stand you? You know, and vice versa, and they call that being in love. Who's the realist here? I think the people that believe in love and falling in love are the realists, and the people that say you can't find anybody are the unrealistic kind of people, because people find each other. I just got a note from a friend of mine in Norway. She's a university professor there, and she drops into the conversation that she's met somebody at 60-some years of age. She's met somebody, you know, and she never thought that was going to happen, you know. And I think that's kind of wonderful, don't you? I think so. It's great. And then sensible unreality is the concept that what is unreal could be sensible someday, could be doable, but it's unreal now, because things that are real today used to be unreal at another point in time. So it's sensible to be open-minded about the eventual realism of many things that are not immediately realistic at this moment. And having lived in this sector myself now, I'm in my 5th decade in this sector. When I think of what we thought wasn't going to be realistic, that's now realistic today, I think we were way too conservative. Way too conservative about our sense of what is real. It has exceeded all expectations. So it's sometimes important to take the unreal seriously so that you can eventually make it real. And of course we can get support from each other to do that. This is a quote from Cecil Beaton I like. Be daring, be different, be impractical, be anything that will assert integrity of vision and imaginative purpose against the play-it-safers, the creatures of the commonplace, the slaves of the ordinary. Can this guy write or what? Huh? How many of you have met the play-it-safers? You know? The slaves of the ordinary, the creatures of the commonplace. Yeah, we don't want that. We're not going to move ahead as a sector by playing it safe, by being afraid of change, by being insecure about the challenges, being slaves of the ordinary. We have to look beyond the ordinary to what has not yet been achieved. That's the kind of courageous leadership we need. That's not going to come from organizational change. It's going to come from courageous people that drive organizational change. Organizations respond to courageous leaders, but no courageous leaders, no courageous change. The origins of that are in the character of people, and we need those kind of characters. People that are willing to plunge into the insecurity, the unknowns, the uncertainties, with the confidence we can get there. Not the people who would tell you, oh my God, I'm so risk averse, you know, this could happen, anything could happen, you won't get much done worrying about that. So you must give birth to your images. They are the future waiting to be born. Fear not the strangeness you feel. The future must enter you long before it happens. Just wait for the birth, for the hour of new clarity. Your images then, what's in your mind, are the future waiting to be born. It's a great kind of metaphor, I think. So how do people do this? I think they do it by talking. As was said earlier, basically build vision in the company of other people that are visionary. We can borrow from each other's vision and create and almost brew up a lot of things simply by supporting each other to do it. Secondly, you need exposure to inspiring examples. There are vastly more inspiring examples than people are even aware of. But if you go looking for them, you'll find them. You'll find people doing amazing things with their lives. And we want people around us that challenge us and push us to go further than we're willing to go. Otherwise, we won't get out of our comfort levels. And it's good to have joy in small gains. It's not like all big accomplishments haven't been preceded by many small gains. So small gains are what we got in the meantime. So if you can enjoy them in the meantime, when the big stuff comes, you'll be in good shape. And there's nothing wrong with fears, doubts, difficulties, setbacks. These are just part of life. It's good to name one's fears and anxieties and doubts and so on, because they are helpful, you know. And if we don't doubt, we don't learn. So it's good to doubt. What would not be good is to let one's doubts be the final word on things. That wouldn't be helpful. But definitely listen to your doubts. Your parents were right. If it doesn't feel right, there's something wrong. So listen to your doubts, but don't let them dominate you. And some people need to affirm the vision from time to time, because it gets weakened by everyday living, and you need to go back and give it a new shot in the arm and continue kind of exploring. So cherish your visions and your dreams, as they are the children of your soul, the blueprints of your ultimate achievements. And again, I love this one, that they're children of your soul. And each person with a disability has a soul, and the good life for them will come from what is it that they were born to do? What is it that they are meant to enjoy? What is it that they see as central to their happiness and fulfillment? These are the powerful questions inbuilt into the life of each person, and let us go where that takes us. Let each life not be wasted by taking it seriously. And that's the great thing about these more individualized options, is that people can have their own soul, and it can be different from mine and yours and somebody else's. And of course, one's own soul is one's destiny. And well, let's take people's soulful possibilities seriously. So ideals arise from this. Ideals are an imaginative understanding of that which is desirable and that which is possible. Okay, I think I'll stop there. And where are we? Are we on schedule here?
We are. We're right on schedule. So, thanks, Michael, for raising some profound issues with us. Before we break into our groups, is there anything that you would like to clarify from Michael's presentation? We will have a chance to have Michael reflect upon our own discussion. Is there anything anybody would like to raise with Michael?
Reminded me a bit of Oscar Wilde's statement about an unreasonable man. Progress is only ever made by unreasonable men. You know, if you're reasonable, then you're kind of just going with the status quo. But you know, you're not happy with it, you're agitating, you're a bit unreasonable. Maybe you change it.
Yeah, that's a great quote. It's a kind of classic, really. And but of course, the unreasonable person is actually the most reasonable in the end, at least as Oscar Wilde would have it. You know, that's good. And dare to be unreasonable at times might not be a bad idea. Just even being able to say, I beg to differ. I think we can do better than this. That would be a kind of useful unreasonableness.
I think what you've done, Michael, is that in our first breakfast conversation we had the big picture, and you've drawn us into the individual. Without the individual, we can't have the big picture, and the big picture without the individual perspective would need to be just something that's a fly-by-night. So thank you for bringing us to really what it's all about, which is, as you say, unprecedented time.
That's great.
So we'll now move on to the discussion. So do you want to go and get a coffee and bring it back to the table, and then we'll set the tables up and I'll tell you what the first question is. This is not morning tea. They're bringing morning tea in 11:15, but just, you know, refresh for coffee and we'll get sorted out. So in terms of what Michael's raised with us, the first question is, what can you imagine better arising from the NDIS? So we've been challenged to imagine better, we've been challenged to look at one person at a time, we've been challenged to breathe. So what can you imagine better arising from the NDIS, which is obviously grounded in this concept of starting with how to get a good life for people. So you need a facilitator, you need a note taker, and then you need somebody to feed back. And after the first question, we'll change seats, so that we would like the facilitator to stay at the same table. So shall we say maybe five minutes or so? I'll see how you're getting on before we get the feedback.
You might have to tell me on this one.
Ready? Okay, folks, can we come together as a group? And thank you to those people that have facilitated it and the note takers. So if we can have somebody to feed back. Peter, can we start with your group? You're feeding back first group.
Yep. We can imagine that the NDIS will break down barriers for people with disabilities and come away from just programs that are written for them to lives that they sort of live out in whatever form that will be. Moving away from control. And we chatted a little bit about the comments that were made about races and women and everything, and now it just seems so unacceptable that that would be the case, and that would be for people with disabilities. And then we tried to think big about, well, what might be things that even we think around the table people with disabilities couldn't do, and you know, drive a car, and you think, well, no, they might have driverless cars, so that's no problem. One of us said something about people that aren't verbal. Well, maybe they might have a voice box or just a technology that connects up with the brain and is quite able to speak. And you know, when you just think if that is the limitation and you address that, or you're thinking about that as a limitation, and we talk about getting married and things, that actually you can just be a lovely person and people could just love you who you are, you know, and it really doesn't make any difference. So well, it does make a difference, but it's not necessarily a limitation in that sense. So I don't know, we were trying to think of things that even we might have as barriers and tried to blow them out of the water as well. So yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, good point. To get rid of our own barriers in order to support people to let the chains of theirs go. Yeah, and I certainly like the way in which you've tossed around what could we imagine that would be different, and what you're imagining is just so normal. So thank you for that. Okay, Ben, can we have feedback from you? Great.
Yep. Okay, so we asked that there be greater choice. So in terms of like services, as well as there may be like a review of services, more variety in options, a stronger community. Hopefully we'll cater for individual goals and options more holistically, as opposed to compartmentalized. That's right.
That's okay, that's good.
More accessible accommodation for like people with physical disabilities that want to move out of home. More control over funding. Provide actually what families need, as opposed to what the funding is actually restricted to. And greater capacity of support. So more support like out of hours, like weekends and stuff, which is like covers transport as well.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot for that, Ben, and for the group. So making sure basically that people get what they want and that there's a lot of support there. So thank you. Can we move to this table, Pauline? Oh, it's Chris.
Yeah,
Yes.
can we just change the resource? The good thing about the NDIS is that we've been living within quite a resource scarcity environment for many decades. And there's a lot of resources in that environment that actually go into controlling the resource and monitoring the resource, etc. Whereas we are moving into an environment where there'll be much greater resource. Now, whether it be dollars, whether it be opportunities, partnerships, etc. So it's the thinking sort of changes from what possibly can be, rather than actually watching what will allow you to do. There will be a need for partnerships to occur, and especially again sort of partnerships outside of organisations and the people people with disabilities, not only relating with the people who support them in their organisations, but also the general community. And I suppose through more opportunities for them to be in the community then sort of gets to experience and be aware of members of their community who have a disability. So there would be a greater connection. Like even the conversation around the passing of the NDIS has actually made people that I know that aren't in the disability sector actually start to think, well, what is this NDIS? And they're actually wanting some clarity and definition of what it is. So it's actually a good barbecue conversation for people who probably wouldn't have even thought about disability in the first place. In regards to the NDIS, the good thing is it's working towards engaging the whole of the country into disability, and I suppose the thing that how I sort of put it is that if you look at things like sport, regardless of what the sport is, there's usually rules of engagement, and everybody understands the rules. I know I learned at one stage that you don't have left-handed hockey players, because they usually sort of wipe people out because they're usually hitting the other way around. So everybody on the hockey field has to play right-handed. The same with rugby league. You've got to throw the ball backwards before you can go forwards. So everybody knows the rules, but within the rules of that engagement, you can actually be as creative as you possibly can be within the game, and that's where the creativity and the possibilities come. So it's more of maybe a commonality of rules across Australia, rather than also then whoever the body is that implements the DCA, that they don't actually prescribe what creativity looks like. That they said this is the environment you work within, and as long as you work within this environment, knock yourselves out with your creativity. People with disabilities facing less barriers and are encouraged to be included in the process, which is and leading an active life. And also, there does need to be some conversations around things like, well, in a brave new world of creativity, what is the risk tolerance of all the players within that? We're just talking about sort of, if there's an environment where you've got staffing sort of ratios, how do you assess the risk of a person with a disability going out and enjoying life? And if that's good, that's fine, it's all okay. But if there is an event that occurs for that person that is then not sheeted back to the provider, that there's appropriate risk tolerance around allowing people to live their lives, and also all the positives and also the challenges that may occur around that.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So obviously picking up the theme of knocking down barriers, creativity and risk tolerance versus risk assessment, which is good to hear. Okay, so Claire, can you feed that back to us now? So if I could just say in response to what can you imagine better arising from the NDIS, what themes did we pick up?
So most tables talked about or noted the importance of breaking down barriers, and there was some talk about not just barriers that other people face, but really looking within and breaking down our own barriers as well. Imagining better that there's more choice, there's greater choice for people, and there's a stronger community and partnerships as well, and some control over funding, and also controlling resources. And there was a nice analogy about being creative within the game.
Okay, thank you. Well, now I'd invite you to look at the second question, the key factors. What are the key factors that you think your team need to start focusing on to imagine better? So, what are the factors, what needs to be put in place, what needs to be happening for your team to start imagining better? Picking up on Michael's presentation, which was imagining better around the individual. So not imagining better so much around systems, but just imagining better on a one-to-one basis with the people that we serve. So could I invite you to, could I invite the facilitators to stay seated and people then to move around and to mix up the groups? So thank you. If you could feedback now, thanks. We may feedback up here, so Claire, if you can face Claire, then that might be easier for Claire to pick up people's comments. So can we start with your table, Chris? Who's going to feedback Claire? Is it Chris? Sorry. Who would feedback? Okay. Well, you want a minute to think about it. We'll go to another table. Who's going to feedback here? Is it you? Okay, great.
Okay, so we've discussed about focusing on the individual, involve people with disabilities, ask the question, what do we want to achieve, like as a service or organisation, think differently, outside the funding parameters, and give people permission to think outside the rules, ask people to consider the future, ask better questions, which therefore creates like active listening, be prepared to reflect and evaluate, and by doing this, be prepared to respond and change direction, and networking and learning, being open to respond to change. Something, can't believe that word.
Needed, the change needed.
Yeah.
That's great. So it all comes down to being open, being responsive, listening deeply. Those are the key factors. So thank you. I will repeat them as we go around, which gives Claire just a little bit more time to get them down.
Yeah.
So how are you going here, Claire?
Okay, thank you.
Great, good. Thanks, Ben, for that. And for the table. Shall we go to your table?
Okay.
Adele.
So we were talking about some of the key factors being asking the questions, how are we enriching people's lives? So the first example that came up was we know that there should be independent living, but yes, we're still building group homes and we're still occupying group homes. So what are the practical things that we need to do? So would it be about introducing the idea of different flatmates, and would it be sleeping in a new place or change, or visiting people who do live independently? So actually start moving towards not just us talking about it and then it will happen in the future, but what are the practical things that we can do with our clients to move towards that. Start getting to know your clients better. I think just carrying on from a lot of what we've been saying about making it more personal, and as Michael was saying, just that being one-to-one with people, and it's oftentimes outside of those formal meeting environments that you do truly get to know someone when you engage with them. And just leading on from that, how are we looking at the real design of people's, we call them holistics, support plans, so HSP, life meeting, path plan, whatever you want to call it. How is it that we're really looking at the practicality of whether that is a suitable model to get to understand people, and then introducing that to families and carers, because we were reflecting that we're often, even the most progressive parents often just go, look, it'll just be me, my wife can't make it, and the rest of the family's busy, and there's probably not really anyone else who'd be able to come, and so I guess maybe how is it that we're representing or that we're sharing how important this stuff is. Considering people's dreams as opposed to the parents and the carers' desires, which of course are incredibly important, but really moving to what does the person truly want. And having a vision for more friends, supporters, networks. When you come over, Patricia, and you were talking about that you have a group of people, and one of the main desires for people with disabilities is the fact that there is a lot of isolation and they don't have the opportunities for the networks, for friends, and to have real connections with people that are outside of family and carers and services. And finally, a capacity building for staff to actually be able to recognise what it is that people are trying to say, to really have that time to listen and to be with people and really convene and spend time. So, yeah.
Well, it sounds like both conversations were very rich. But certainly I think the question you're raising about, how do we support people to have real lives, is it through the sort of planning we're doing at the moment, or what is feasible, or what is palatable to people? I just sort of pick up on that. Claire and I are involved in a social networking group that the centre runs. About 8 people with disability come along, with intellectual disability. got here is that people no longer have to come to a group like that, but they can actually find their own pathway and they can find their way into places where they become socially networked. And that really is a vision. I mean, we're always trying, and I know many of us in this room have been supporting people to make that happen, but we're still trying. So that's a vision forward for me. I mean, I think, it's frustrating, we try things that don't necessarily work, but when you go back, some of us were around, as Michael said, when that group of people wouldn't have been coming to the university for a networking group. They would be locked away in an institution. So that vision, we had that vision, we cracked. So I agree with your point, Michael. It's always good to have that forward vision. Whether it's like a Branson to go to the moon or just to have a friend, I think is more realistic. So if we could take the last group, which is back to you, Chris.
Thanks. The first point was that we felt that it's getting started now and doing something now even within the current environment that we're in, notwithstanding sort of the change that's sort of coming towards us, through the person sending us July next year and then NDS 7 years later, that we should actually be doing things now, not to wait. Because it's actually creating the examples and stories that then give people a solid reason to see a different vision. So we like the idea of actually Michael sort of saying, it's good to sort of think about all these visionary things, but you're still going to do it one by one, and that's where you start the change. Challenging our own assumptions as to like how even staff sort of relate and or work, but not only staff but then management as well, around sort of what is it that what's the environment that leads to creativity, and usually it's the staff that have the creative ideas along with the people that they're working with, the people with disabilities. And it's encouraging an environment that sort of lifts those ideas up and then sort of says, okay, well, what's feasible? It may be not now, as Michael said, it may not be Monday, but it might be when the planets are more aligned that you can actually implement those ideas. Asking the right questions. Again, sort of I suppose the fundamental, if you actually are going to ask a question of somebody, just allow yourself just as much time to listen to the answer, and don't assume you already know the answers. And even declaring that sort of for staff and organisations in particular, and also families and individuals, that the new environment is going to have predicting that and normalising there is going to be discomfort. There's a certain level of anxiety because it's all about change, and that anxiety is not destructive. It's actually you've got to sit with it and then work out sort of how you harness it. It's just unlocking creativity and evolving vision from the clients and families and staff. There was a radical thing which just get rid of management because they get in the way of a good idea. So Shirley, that was Shirley's idea. Could be an endangered species in the next few years as management.
Yeah, Shirley, at the table when you raised that, it's very challenging. It's a vision for the future. So the creativity idea, thanks for that. Both Chris and the table. So I think that's it.
Okay.
Would you care to feedback?
Yeah, sure. So some of the key factors that you and your team need to start focusing on to, I guess, imagine better. Well, all three groups raised, I guess, the issue of asking better or asking different questions. And just a couple of the key questions that came up are, how are we enriching people's lives? And, what does the person truly want? But not just asking the questions, it's also really important to be open and responsive and to really deep and continual listen and listen to the answers that you're receiving. There was also talk about knowing your clients better. Are we using suitable models? Each client has the potential for great creativity. We need to unlock that creativity.
capacity building for staff and challenging assumptions, and unlocking that creativity with staff as well. And the final one was about getting started now.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we've got one last question to go. Now, the last question is, it's just there behind where Sam is standing. I started off by saying that Block says that if we can declare a possibility, if we can make a declaration of possibility, it's not necessarily an action plan, but just the fact that we put a statement out there gives us something to build to aspire to. And so what declaration of possibility can you make that has the power to transform your organisation from a standardised model to one that inspires you? There's been some talk in some of the groups, I think Michael raised it, that in the 70s we had the group home model, fairly standardised, it continues to go on. The NDIS is obviously now giving us a chance to put out a declaration of possibility that will move us from this more standardised model to one that inspires you, that picks up on some of those pointers that we just heard around the table. So if I can ask you to change once again, and then just think of a declaration that you would be prepared to make in your own organisation, or to take back to your organisation for possibilities. Okay, thanks, Sam. So we'll just go around the table. Ben, are you the person giving feedback on this one? Just the general thing. I think it goes like okay, that. Maybe if we're looking backwards.
So we just got a few points. There was like everyone was started off with all the declaration is huge, so yeah. I think you're kind of living some of the points that we're going to make. So to start off with saying it'd be really nice to just be able to go anywhere to be able to enjoy life rather than to go to a disability service. Because you go to a disability, so you starting off in the negative or in the I need you to make my life. So moving from service and then changing to facilitating the enrichment of people's lives, that should be what we do rather than servicing people to just be alone and do something which is necessary, especially which is very have an evolving plan, so not so much to so what evolve, we're all just laughing at that all of us can say, something sat down with them and then not only are they going to, potentially that's too much of a huge box sort of question, but and if they did, they'd probably answer it completely differently the next day. So it's more about, as Michael was saying, having that evolving plan, being ready for constant change around life as it is. The willingness to start a conversation but not knowing where it could go. So we often don't pose, ask for what people's dreams are because we're scared that we might not be able to deliver, or that it might go into an area that makes anyone at the table uncomfortable, anyone in a person's life uncomfortable, the service uncomfortable because they can't do it, and so then you go back to the limitation side of things. So it's about being bold and going on that journey with people.
I like that idea of starting a conversation and not necessarily having any idea where it's going to end up. It's great. So thanks for that. And your idea, Ben, is at the core of it, to be able to go anywhere. So this table, who's the...
That's me again.
Oh, very good, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. Well, notwithstanding that we're in an environment that's still building clarity, so you don't want to declare too quickly before you have some idea what's going on. For some organisations where they might be quite large and or disability services is a smaller component of their activity, it might be hard to sort of have a clear declaration because it's one of many parts of the organisation as opposed to probably a predominant part of their activity. But within the areas where this this change is going to impact, the declaration does need to be shared up and down with all people. So there needs to be sort of a declaration of engagement, ownership, leadership by all parts. So it can't be just the people at the ground level. It can't be just the middle management or supervisors. If further up the food chain they're not engaged or aware or understanding what it fundamentally means, then it's not going to work.
Great.
I suppose it's also where does the declaration sit within your mission, because again each organisation has a mission, and does that declaration, whatever it is, line up with your mission? Because if it's not in alignment with your mission, then that's another conversation that the organisation has to actually have.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Some very good points there, particularly around the sense of engagement and where does it all sit. So thank you. So the last table.
I'm giving feedback.
Pauline.
I think we've tried to write a declaration here.
Oh, good. Very good.
Okay, so it starts with I've seen a transformation where people with a disability have choice and greater flexibility in services no longer exist, rather that individuals share the access to their own goals or to support, to share the access to their goals, support a good life.
Oh, sounds good. Well done.
Could I ask you to say that one more time, please?
Shall I just give it you?
No, just one more time. I'll just capture some words.
I've seen a transformation where people with a disability have choice. Services no longer exist as individuals share the access to their own goals, support, and a good life.
Okay, well that sounds really good. Spot on. So Claire, you're writing and now we ask you to feedback.
Okay.
So I think we wanted to see the words I've seen a transformation, is that right?
Yes.
I've seen the transformation.
We like the Martin Luther
I have
sort
a
of
dream.
statement. I've seen it.
I've seen a transformation.
I have a dream.
It's good. Okay, thanks Claire.
Okay. Excuse me. So the declaration of possibilities is that you can go anywhere to enjoy life. You don't need to go to a disability service. You can access anything and anyone, and you can go anywhere to enjoy life. It's about facilitating enrichment of people's lives and have an evolving plan, not just one plan that you stick to, but it evolves over time, just like visions. And be bold and have willingness to start a conversation without knowing where it might lead or what might come up, or stepping on people's toes. It's about engagement, ownership and leadership, and it's organisation-wide. This doesn't just apply to the disability sector. That might just be one part of your organisation, but this is organisation-wide. And it's also important to check, does the declaration sit in line with the mission and what are the values of the organisation? And that last one is about transformation, empowering people with choice. It's no longer about the services, but people have access to their own goals, and we've seen this happen.
Great. Okay, thanks very much for capturing it all, Claire. And thank you all for participating in very important conversations, bringing the whole thing back from the big picture of the first breakfast through to the individual. It's morning tea time, and I'd like to suggest that we only take maybe 10 minutes for morning tea, and then if you come back, if we're back by 11:10, Michael will then sum up his reflection. Michael's got a cab waiting to whisk him to the airport at 11:45. So Michael will talk to us for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Then at some stage, Ben and Shirley are going to make a comment on how well they think the conversations line up with the lived experience of disability. And then I'll finish up with some housekeeping and comment on that book and the other book, and also just talk a little bit about our numbers are low today, so I think maybe we can be a bit more flexible about whether people would like to bring some other people along, but we just need to tie that down a little bit more than that. So take a break now and we'll start again. Okay, I think we're set to go. So thanks, Michael. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, well, we'll get started. One of the things that, as I was listening to the various comments, I was struck by was how prescient the comments were in terms of what's actually already transpired in terms of person-centered ways of working around the world, including here in Australia. That almost everything that was seen as desirable in the comments has actually been achieved. What hasn't been achieved is the more systematic making available of these things. But the actual innovations that people were speaking of have actually been pioneered to a very significant extent. And while you know, not everyone's benefited from them as yet, it's amazing just how we end up naming these things because of the kind of universal quality of benefit that comes from flexibility, from people being in charge of their own life, being able to enjoy the fullness of community. All of the things that were mentioned are universals that have been achieved, but are not sufficiently widely available in many localities. Even this idea, which I thought was really outside the square thinking, to could you get rid of all the managers, which was one of the suggestions, in fact has been attempted. And even though we don't think of it in that way, by people being in charge of their own service, you're essentially giving them an offset against the managers. So in this sense, managers don't have the final say, the individual does. So even though it sounded a bit radical or revolutionary, in reality that's in fact what people can do, because in effect you can divorce the service system. When you have enough of the tools, you can kind of just do your own thing. And so in that way, it has forced us to think about partnering with people with disabilities and their families rather than providing for them. And that's a quite different starting point kind of relationship. Now, as I mentioned, though, we have plenty of innovations, but we have weak adoption of them in many cases. And so the kind of leadership we're going to need is of course, a continuation of innovation. We're going to hear about that in the next week. But we also need a sustained attempt to make these innovations more widely available to people. And that increased rate of adoption of already innovated developments has, of course, transpired in many ways. The reality why we're in this position today to be able to proceed is because we have so many good examples of virtually anything you could think of. You would find good examples. And many things you've not thought about, we actually have good examples, but we're just not everyone is familiar with them. And even the emphasis on technological breakthroughs, we are on the brink of massive technological breakthroughs in terms of what people will be able to do in terms of their physical functioning, for instance. A woman with a very high spinal cord injury just finished the London Marathon this year, and yet she would, using what they call an exoskeleton suit, which essentially the suit walks for you, and it's adapted from military and NASA type technology, and finished the London Marathon, but otherwise people would say she's paralyzed. But paralysis stops being significant when you've got some means to walk. And so some of these technologies are actually, I mean, awesome, if you want to use the term awe, because we simply are on the brink of them and we're not yet used to them. But imagine what might come from that. In a sense, it's almost a cyborg kind of reality, as many writers have mentioned. Also, I think what we need to think about is the fact that we now have agencies that have converted all of their group fixed standardized models into individual one-at-a-time services and lifestyles. Not just for a few people, but every single person they serve has a one person at a time option. And that would be great if you started from just one person at a time, but this is agencies that had to convert from a program mix that was started, 40, 50 years ago, and move it into this realm. And so if we couldn't do that conversion, all those resources would stay in the old program models, and we'd never be able to kind of reposition those resources so they can be used one person at a time. So I think it would be a comfort for many people to know that that's been done, that 100% of people in some agencies have essentially enjoyed an individual option. And secondly, these individual options have been sustained, not for just a few years, but for decades. That we now have people that had converted over 30 years ago from group standardized service models into one person at a time models, and they're still in one person at a time options. So that's very significant from a technical point of view, because of course if you can do that for a few, at some point you can do it for the many. And that's our point here. Why should only a few benefit from these? We would hope that large numbers of people could, but before you do it for large numbers, you must do it for few, and the few has already been done. We have many examples of that. In fact, there are jurisdictions that in the last year or two, small jurisdictions that have added thousands of more individual options, simply because once you can do it for a few again, then it's not that hard to do it for larger numbers. But we could go further in that, and we can say that, in fact, we now have examples of partnering that extend well beyond services. Some of what many people here mentioned was, could we blend natural supports with formal supports? That's a very key question, because if you're going to enjoy the fullness of community and fullness of community life, go anywheres, as the phrase was put to us, it means that you're welcome anywheres, and you would be supported to go anywheres. And of course, we now have examples of people essentially joining groups and being part of things that we've never had seen until recent times. And a day doesn't go by that there's not some new example of everywhere. In other words, people are simply doing things that everybody else is doing. And of course, you can only do that if you are in community. And a lot of people don't say, oh, could I go anywhere with my staff? Actually, a lot of people like to go somewhere without them. So if we're going to go somewhere, we need to have other people with us. And look to the community for our support, not simply to staff type resources. Nothing wrong with staff, but how many of you would just like to be in the community just being yourself, not standing out because you've got this entourage of paid help and whatnot, but rather people simply being in the world in a way that's, just doesn't draw attention to themselves as different. And fortunately, we can do that today. We have many examples of it. We don't have a lot of time to kind of get into these examples today, but it would be useful for a future discussion to look at how people could get assistance from the community, but do that in a way that's kind of dignified and where support is sort of naturally offered, if you want to put it that way. Another thing too was the dismantling of top-down control. One of the things about individualized funding, self-direction, and these kind of trends in systems is that control sits very close to the person and in the person's hands. So the top-down has less effect when you can essentially veto top-down and essentially kind of opt out of whatever is coming top down. And that's what we do see, that a lot of people, when they get control of the life, the last thing they want to do is be part of some big system. And what they really want to be is not part of a big system, but simply a person kind of having their own life, getting on with it, and insulated from a lot of that bureaucracy and so on. Very few people say, oh, if I could just have more bureaucratic experiences, then my deepest longings would be met. But in fact, what most people would want is fewer bureaucratic experiences, fewer connections to systems, and a lot more autonomy to kind of get on with it without the system. And that's, I've written about this in some of my writings, but we now have, again, many examples where that has taken place. Also, the idea that people are going to be able to do this simply with power and money isn't the case. That people can have the power and money, but if there's no support to be imaginative, no support to try new things, then what you see with a lot of individual funding is that people are going to buy the same old, because it's the easiest thing to buy. And so people buy off-the-shelf options rather than being helped to be creative, because it's harder to create something you've never done before than to do the simple thing of just purchasing what's already available. And so one of the things to pay attention to is, what's it going to take to support people to be creative and resourceful in their more individualized kinds of situations? Because if we dump people into individualization but don't support them to be creative, then a lot of people just get stymied by the challenges of developing kind of opportunities they've never created for themselves or others before. So in this sense, we shouldn't underestimate that people need a strengthening to do things that are challenging. And a lot of what we're asking people to do is to be very resourceful, very creative, but we can't expect people to do that without support. And whether that's the frontline staff, whether it's the person with a disability, whether it's families, we don't want to dump people and dump people into situations that are going to work against them. And as I've said in my writings, you can disappoint people one at a time. You don't need to do it in groups anymore. And that's clearly not what we're interested in. We're not interested in neglecting and disappointing people one at a time. We're hoping people will be successful one at a time. And to do that, we need to think about the supports. What kinds of supports do people need to be brave, to be courageous, to be innovative, to try new things, to be open, and so on. If the supports aren't there, then we'll move a lot slower. So that'd be a kind of reaction to that. The possibilities are one thing, but to take them up and run with them, I think can be kind of scary for a lot of people. It can take them out of what they know, and so on. And they may not even have good examples to model after, and that can also slow people down. Whereas if we give those kinds of resources, invest in people, then people can, of course, do so much better. But I'd be a little bit worried of simply dumping people into things without some investment in their capacities to kind of move ahead. I like the idea of enrichment, because enrichment means that there is more to be enriched. And people tend to think of enrichment as financial rather than existential. And if one thinks of existential enrichment, you're really saying fill up with and on life. And that isn't necessarily financially significant. To have a fuller life doesn't need to be a more expensive life. Though in the material world, that's what people think, oh, the only way I can have a full life is to have more resources. But the fullness of life has a lot more to do with your experiences in life than simply, cash and things like that. When we think about that kind of enrichment, then you're really talking about experiences. You're looking at relationships, connections, things that may not necessarily involve financial resources, but people tend to not think about enrichment unless they think about money first. And if you could just put money aside and think about what would be a good life, what would be enjoyable, eventually you can find ways to use your resources to get that in many cases. We talked a little bit here about the necessity of having practical steps to get somewhere, and the practical steps would be another dimension really of quality. Many of the practical steps have actually been developed already, but if you don't know about them, then you can't really kind of take them on. So in this sense, we have a bit of a challenge to distribute the knowledge, experience, examples, methods, and things that people have already kind of pioneered that work for themselves, so that people, could see what these are and then apply them to their own situation. So in a sense, you want to move things from the leading edge back to people that are just starting out, but have the advantage of all of the experience that others have pioneered on their behalf. And that's a very important process, because if each agency and each family and each person have to start from scratch all on their own, it's a kind of waste of time. Why should we put people starting from scratch when we have agencies that have done many important things, we have families that have done many important things, we have people with disabilities that have done many important things, and we in many cases have systems that have done very important things. But why not be a little bit better at sharing that and encouraging people to kind of familiarize themselves with that? For instance, I know agencies that simply refuse to serve people initially until they have a personal network. In other words, they say, let's get you a network first, and then we'll figure out how to support your lifestyle. But if you've got nobody in your life, then we're missing like a key thing. Like your life should be kind of an expansion of your network. The particular agency I first saw that with has a network for everyone. If you arrive without a network, they just help you build one. And it's, of course, a network that suits you. It's not like, oh, we called up Rent a Network and they sent over a used network, but rather that we have a network that is kind of tailor-made to the person. And imagine people that when they say the key resource in their life is their network, not their funding. Then you're into a whole different kind of universe, really, in terms of what's possible for people. Of course, in many agencies, they do the opposite. They say, we'll get you your service and then we'll get you your network, but somehow the network never arrives. It never got the invitation. And so people are served but have no network. In other words, they remain socially isolated. I also like the hopefulness of the commentary today. It was exceedingly hopeful, and we need to remember that what gets people to get on the wagon, so to speak, and do something is hope. And hope is a battle that is constant, and we must stay hopeful, be hopeful, and support people not to give up hope. Hope is the seed that unleashes a new life, and we have to be very, very hopeful. That hope is the platform upon which good lives get built, and the message has to be very hopeful. And in that sense, it's not that we want people to be hopeful without cause. So if we're going to sustain hope, we have to give them evidence and cause, and be prepared to struggle with that, because we have a lot of people that have given up hope, that need hope, need the inspiration, but have very good questions that are going unanswered. So at a psychological level, if we could think of this, that the transformation has to be partly psychological, and part of that is we must replace a kind of pessimism despair, hopelessness, kind of negativity, with something that is positive, uplifting, encouraging, and so on. And best to do that by simply having examples that kind of capture that. It's one of the things that we should never, though, be defined by is something like the NDIS. The NDIS might be a very useful starting point, but one of the things that human beings should never do is to succumb to a system in its own terms. That one of the things that makes us human is that if we don't like the system, we change it. And that's the spirit that we need with the NDIS, because if the NDIS is getting in the way of people's lives, then off with its head, as far as I'm concerned. The NDIS is no longer serving our purpose. Be done with it, you know. In other words, we shouldn't be shaped by NDIS. NDIS should be shaped by us. We should never relinquish to the next funding system control of us and our thoughts and our hopes and our dreams to any system. Systems are tools to serve us, not that we should serve systems. And here we are in a mad rush to conform to the new enslavement, when what we should be is in a mad rush to not ever be enslaved again by a system, but to see beyond it, to be able to challenge it, because a group of sincere people in Canberra cannot possibly have the answer that we need. We're going to have to do thinking they've never done, and in that sense, much like the DSA in the 80s, it unleashed a period of creativity in Australia that transcended the original designers of that legislation. And that's what we should hope for here in 2013, is that what will be the community response to this opportunity will overwhelm that system, because we want to go so much further, so much faster, so much better than the what the system saw at the outset. Now, that's not to overthrow the NDIS. After all, we're all law-abiding, but rather to fulfill its potentials in ways that are not foreseen by the originators of it, if you see what I mean. Okay, just one final thought, and that is that you really, if you're going to have the resources to do this, you need to close off options that are now dated. So we just can't keep creating the same options that we created in the 70s in the next century. We have to become good at closing off options and using those resources now in new ways that are more in tune with the times. And that technical challenge of closing down so that something new can spring up is basically all you can do in a world with limited resources. And we cannot afford to keep going out-of-date models when we need the new ones. So the only real logical solution is close off gradually options that are now dated and take those monies and divert them into newer, better options. It's almost like in 2013, why are we funding rotary dial phones in an iPhone age? And some of those service models, the sheltered workshops, the group homes, and these things were the best thinking of the 70s, but we're not in the 70s anymore. This is 2013. Why are we using our resources to carry on with those things when it's time for a quite different mix of options and opportunities? So to get to those, we're going to have to convert these, and what that means is not only do people leave these options, the resources leave with them, and the option closes. And if we're not prepared to do that, we'll be stymied by trying to keep the other options going, and we will run out of resources very quickly. We've simply got to get better at saying we do less of this and more of this. And as we do that, of course, we're going to find all kinds of entrenched interests that push back against us, but that's the new leadership challenge, because we can't afford not to convert those resources into more individualized, one person at a time resources. We simply can't do it. And the good news is we have done it, but we have to resolve that we have to go down the road of undoing somebody else's entrenched interests so that we can get to some of these options. And that will not be an easy struggle, but it is a necessary struggle. Otherwise, we simply wait for some bonanza of new unattached monies that will never, ever come. And so I'm not going to go to people and say we can do this with new monies, because there simply will never be that kind of a tsunami of new resources. We've got to go back in and reshuffle how we use the resources. And as I said, we now have examples of that having been done. So I don't think the issue is technical now. The issues are more leadership, values, politics, those kinds of things, because the technical issues of how you do it have not been a permanent difficulty. Now, you may not know that or believe that, but if I can be of some help, I can acquaint anybody who's interested with many of these kinds of examples, perhaps not in this occasion, but at another occasion I'd be happy to do that. Other than that, I just wanted to thank people for just all of the positive, hopeful, inspiring comments that I heard this morning. This shows the value of people coming together and supporting each other, because we all can't do this alone. We need each other, and so this kind of affirming of the vision, but doing it collectively, is good for us, because it'll keep us going, it'll make us feel we're not alone, and of course we have each other to draw upon. So no change is ever done by single individuals acting alone. It's always done by joining up with others, and we, in a sense, we have in this little room this morning an example of a much bigger social movement that's out there that really wants the same things, and we dare not forget that there are people all over the place that would have sat in our conversation this morning and felt right at home, and so we need to remember that we're part of something a lot bigger, and it'll outlive us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and I will thank you now, just before we finish around about 12, but I know there will be a taxi waiting for you just shortly. Thanks for your comments. Thanks for your deep listening to the conversations, so that you could actually respond directly to what we had developed together today. That's such a skill, and we have benefited by your reflection, which is based upon years of wisdom. So thank you for your comments on hope. You found us as a group hopeful. Thank you for that particular comment that the NDIS shouldn't be driving us, but we should be driving it. So this won't be the last time we see you, and once again I'll just ask people to join with me in thanking you. And I was just wondering, Claire, if you could take Michael down to the foyer. The taxi should be outside. If there's any problem, I'll give you my phone. Well, I just thought at this stage, Ben, would it be, and Shirley, a good time for you just to make some comment on how you're found today in terms of, you know, what we've been discussing? Is it relevant to the lives of people with disability? So I'm just wondering, we can...
I think Shirley was going to go first.
Okay then, Shirley, great. I've just asked Sam if he needs to get any speakers over near you or anything like that. Great. Okay, just a couple of minutes. While we're doing that, just to tell you that the book that we gave out today is by Stephen Sturck and Helen Sanderson. For those of you that know, and I'm sure we all do know, that Helen Sanderson's made an amazing contribution to the concept of person-centeredness, but more recently she's been putting out books with people who have got another type of skill, and Stephen Sturck's skill is as a person, well, first of all, he's a family member, has a child with a disability, but he's also a person who's worked in the area of human resources, and so Helen Sanderson has partnered with him to give us a book. It sort of reinforces what Michael was saying, you know, those things about quality. If we don't know the skills, then, or if we've got people that surround us that need to be enriched in their skills, this book is really good. It sort of covers things like human resources in a more person-centred manner. So Stephen will be coming to the breakfast, I think it's in May, and from time to time, in terms of the notes, we'll dip into the book and put some notes in our handouts as well. So I think we're ready now. So thanks, Shirley and Ben.
Person with a disability should have more choices in their life and organize own staff. One person at a time would be easier for me because they will have time and do what I want to do with support. From today's conversation, it seemed everyone understands the choices, not the barriers that disability might have, and listen to them.
I guess like from today, one of the big things that came out was like we need to focus a lot on like individuals and their goals, not necessarily their goals that go towards that program, but more their life goals, more big goals. For example, like my big goal is like moving out of home and living independently. So just like I guess today it really made me think about my future and what like I want to do and how to do it. So yeah.
Thanks for your comment. So just to finish up, I did say in the agenda for today I would just comment on some change strategies from the Sherlock and Vertigo. That's a book that we haven't got, but that book also goes with participating in these conversations. It's on page 4, just there. When you get this book, hopefully, I think I might have given this out the last time. At the back of the book, there is a self-assessment that you can do on your own organisation. Because Sherlock and Vertigo, and Sherlock, of course, is now about 83. He's still writing books, and he's the godfather of this quality of life movement, I suppose you could say, and he's writing with Miguel Vertigo, who is from Spain. But they've got these 8 pointers here. They believe that change, as it does relate to individualised funding, does come about through high performance teams, a system of support, evidence-based practice, innovation, thinking styles that are one person at a time thinking styles, focusing on the person, really rather than the organisational outputs, performance-based management, and overcoming resistance to change. So if you go to the next page, based upon that, and this sort of relates, I think, to what Michael was saying in terms of how do we go about, change within an organisation, that there are strategies out there that have been out there for a while but some of them we may need to start talking about in-house more. So their strategies are that you self-assess against those pointers. Then the second point is, the action step 1, self-assess your organisation against the challenges, then self-assess your organisation against the 8 proposed strategies. I've only read out the 8 proposed strategies. The challenges are more broad-based, but also mentioned in the book. Then you develop an action plan that enables cultural change, and then you engage in strategic foresight, and they've got 6 stages of strategic foresight there. So I recommend the book to you, and when it comes at the next breakfast, hopefully they'll be here and we can distribute them. So just about the next breakfast, it's on the Thursday after Easter, Sam, is that right? It's the Thursday the 4th. And the speaker is outlined there for you on page 7 of this booklet. And he's going to pick up the ownership conversation. And Darren Ginley is from My Place in Western Australia. Last year we had Greg Lewis that talked about My Place and also the employment service in Western Australia. But what Darren will be focusing on is the way in which My Place has been built up and in and around people who have been able to secure individualised packages within Western Australia. So it will have quite a practical edge to it. It will build upon what Michael was saying, one person at a time. But I am aware that our numbers are down today. So for those of you where there's only one rep from an organisation, if you wanted to bring somebody else on a more consistent basis, I think that would be, we probably could accommodate that. Or if there's a particular topic, like Peter approached me about next time because he thought this was something that his organisation needed to hear, we could probably accommodate more numbers. The idea would be to send me an email or to send Sam an email, and then we'll get Margaret, our executive officer, to check with people that are coming or not coming in time enough to know just how far we can extend the invitation. But we certainly need to have people like yourselves here to get the dialogue going and to make sense of it. So do let me know if you're thinking that you might bring somebody else. And of course we have to drill down on it a little bit in terms of breakfast numbers, and if we go over, then we might ask some people if they wouldn't mind putting in for breakfast if they're bringing a whole troop of people with them. So I usually like to finish with just a round of how you're feeling and how's today been for you. So one person at a time. Can I start with you, Linda? You're used to our setup through facilitation. So how are you feeling and how's it been for you?
No, I really enjoyed today. I was lucky enough to see Michael at his workshop last week as well. And I really liked the comment on hope, because that's where I have to, I think that's where we all have to operate from hope. And hope, I don't really hope, I know there's going to be a better future with disabilities. But I really enjoyed today.
Great. Okay, so we'll come around this way, can you? Catherine?
I found it quite inspiring today, and last breakfast with Michael Goldsworthy was sort of focused on the organisation, and today's brought it back to the individual. So, yeah, very inspiring.
Good, thanks, Catherine. Julie?
I really enjoyed today. I like the fact that it was very much focused on the individual.
Yeah, I'm inspired as well. I found it very inspirational, and the power of imagining plus resolve.
Yes, I always find that Michael has, a new message. You can always interpret, even if it's some of his old messages, somehow they always fit the period that we're going through. So I found it, I learned a lot from listening to you today. How are you feeling?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everyone else. I think just having that hope and that inspiration, and you know, that we also have to not be, you know, stay as part of a system, that we are creating a system as we go along. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember, because I think that a lot of the dialogue in our sector has been around, oh my gosh, there's going to be this big change, but how are we going to implement it? And just all of that confusion around it, where it's like, hang on a second, we can own it along with the people that we work with. So, you know, just to remind us to grab that. It's important. Thanks. Thank you. Maria.
Yes, I loved it today, and I love the words that were thrown around, like the dreams, the vision, the hope, and you know, not to be so complacent and just, you know, don't be afraid to say I beg to differ, you know, just think outside the box. So I love that. Yeah.
Good. Chris.
I found it really good because it sort of affirms some of the things that we're trying to do, and I've also got a list of things I've got to go back and do. But yeah, look, it's the whole change is scary, and you can either let it defeat you, or you can sort of just ride along with it and enjoy the ride. I was sort of thinking that Michael might be a little bit delusional, where he thought that we should actually revolt against NDIS, and thinking, yeah, that's a courageous thing for somebody who's about to hop on a plane.
Yeah, that's right, to be...
So it can be revolutionary, got to be in the room.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Chris. Sue.
I really enjoyed today. I love listening to Michael as well. I think I'm taking away so much professionally, and to think about professionally and personally, and in my own work with clients. So much of what he discussed today, and you know, put forward in terms of creating vision is going to be really useful. And I'm just sort of thinking about how I can go back and translate that to my colleagues in a form that they can make useful in their own work. So I've been very grateful to be here today.
Thank you for coming in. Shirley, how's it been for you today?
Productive.
Oh, great. Thank you. Sarah.
Oh, I've really enjoyed listening to Michael today. It's been very helpful, and I just like the idea of partnering with individuals and their families rather than providing for.
Good.
I guess from today, I'm excited for the future and to see what it holds for everyone.
Good. Thank you. Harley.
I think it was great today. Also encouraging us to ask ourselves, our clients and our organisations the hard questions, and be prepared to maybe, you know, troubleshoot if they're not going to go the way we thought they were, or either way, but always bringing it back to the client and well, person with a disability, will there be clients anymore? What does that look like? So to be part of that change is very inspirational, and for us to put our footprint on that would be better.
That's a nice way to express it. Claire, how's it been for you?
I really enjoyed the morning. I quite liked Michael's talk about visioning. It was nice to revisit that and just to refresh.
Great. And Sam, how's it been for you?
I think there was something said along the lines I really like this, that you think it might not even be possible, it's probably already been done somewhere. I think I really like that. And just a final reminder, please fill in the survey monkey. I'll be sending around another one soon. If the last one, you can still fill that in if you haven't already. And visit the forum, photos and videos, more of that as well.
Can I just check that, I know you've sent instructions, but are people feeling comfortable about getting onto the forum? It's electronic forum?
We know the survey monkey. I'll fill it in this time.
Thank you. Because the photos are really great. I'd like to have a look at them.
As long as they don't end up on Facebook.
I can't promise that. They're online. What happens to them from there? Let's if anyone hasn't been getting emails from me, let me know as well. I should hopefully have everything.
Okay, so we'll see you Thursday after Easter with Darren Gindley. I don't know, you've had contact with Darren, so is there anything else you want to tell us about him?
Sounds like a nice guy on the phone.
That sums it up. Thanks.